I thought I was just doing another weekend job, tidying up a neglected yard for a woman who didn't want to bother with leaves piling up in late autumn. But from the moment I stepped onto her property, I could feel there was something different. In the air, I didn't expect to be drawn into someone else's quiet world of routine, loss, and the kind of courage it takes to let someone in again. What started with a rake and a handshake turned into something that would leave a mark on me deeper than any job ever had, and all it took was one unexpected sentence. "Come in before the neighbors see us. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." It was early November when I pulled into the driveway of a modest 2-story home nestled at the end of a cul-de-sac in a neighborhood I hadn't worked in before. The job was simple enough: rake up the leaves in the front and backyard, trim the overgrown shrubs, and maybe clear out a few weeds along the walkway. The air was crisp, with that sharp chill that hinted winter was around the corner, and the kind of silence that told you most of the houses nearby were occupied by older residents. Quiet, respectable types who didn't want noise or strangers around too often. I grabbed my rake from the back of my truck and walked toward the house, admiring the way the maple trees in the front yard had dropped a blanket of amber and crimson. There was something oddly peaceful about it. I knocked on the door just to let the client know I'd arrived, and after a few seconds it opened a crack. She peeked out, first cautious, maybe even suspicious, then opened the door wider and stepped into view. She looked to be in her late 40s or early 50s. Her dark brown hair was loosely pulled back, strands falling around her face, and she wore an oversized gray cardigan that almost swallowed her frame. There was something about her posture, controlled but tired, that made me think she'd been living quietly for a long time. Her name was Vanessa. I remembered it because it was the only word she said in that first interaction. Just Vanessa, and a small nod, as if that was all I needed to know. I introduced myself, told her I'd get started right away, and she just nodded again before closing the door gently. No small talk, no warm welcome, just a quiet retreat. Back into whatever world she'd been in before I got there. I went to work raking, starting with the front yard. The leaves were damp from an earlier rain, which made the job slower than usual, and the occasional gust of wind tried to undo my progress. Still, I found the rhythm of the work comforting. There's something about raking that makes you feel like you're cleaning more than just a yard, like you're clearing a path through whatever's been sitting around too long. Every so often, I'd glance up at the house. I couldn't see much through the windows. Curtains were drawn tight, but once I caught movement behind the living room glass, a silhouette standing just far enough back to be hidden, watching, maybe just checking on me, maybe something else. By mid-afternoon, I had most of the front yard cleared, and the driveway was looking clean. I paused to drink some water and stretch my back when the door creaked open again. Vanessa stepped out, this time holding a small thermos. She walked down the steps slowly, as if testing each one, and held the thermos toward me without a word. I took it, unsure if I should thank her or wait for her to speak. She just gave a slight shrug and looked over her shoulder, scanning the quiet street before murmuring something under her breath I almost didn't catch. That's when she said it. "Come." And before the neighbors see us, she didn't wait for me to respond. She just turned and walked back inside, leaving the door slightly open. It was such a strange sentence, gentle but urgent, like a whisper with weight. A moment I just stood there, rake in one hand, thermos in the other, wondering if I'd imagined it. Then I looked around the street. It was empty, no neighbors, no prying eyes, just that curious silence. I hesitated a few more seconds, then stepped inside, gently pushing the door open with my foot. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and something floral, like lavender soap. It was warm, dimly lit, and incredibly clean but lived in, not sterile. She was already in the kitchen, pouring herself a cup of tea, her back to me as if she hadn't just made one of the strangest invitations I'd ever heard. I stood in the entryway, sure of what to do. This wasn't part of the job. Most clients didn't invite me in unless there was a broken faucet or a light bulb to fix. I looked down at my boots, still damp with grass and mud, and stepped out of them before walking further in. She didn't say anything, until she turned around and handed me a second cup. "They watch everything," she said, eyes flicking toward the window. "Every move, every visitor. I figured if you're coming in, might as well do it without giving them something to whisper about." It wasn't fear in her voice, it was exhaustion. As if she'd spent too many years managing appearances and was just now starting to care. A little less. She didn't smile, but her face softened, like she was trying to remember how. I nodded, sipped the tea, and said the first thing that came to mind. "You've got a lot of leaves out back, too." Her eyes met mine, and for a second, it looked like she was about to laugh. But she didn't. She just nodded, and we stood there in that warm kitchen, surrounded by silence. The rake still leaning against the porch railing outside, and in that still moment I realized something had shifted, not just in the job, but in the air between us. I didn't know what yet, but it was enough to keep me curious. The next morning, I arrived a little earlier than I had the day before, not because I needed the extra time for the yard, but because I couldn't stop thinking about that moment. In her kitchen, something about the way she said that line, "Come in before the neighbors see us." It had stayed with me longer than it should have for such a short sentence. I'd replayed it while driving home, again while washing up, and once more as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering why it felt like more than just a passing comment. When I pulled into her driveway again, the front curtains were still closed. The house looked exactly as it had the day before, quiet, reserved, like it had learned to keep secrets. I got out and started raking again, focusing on the backyard. This time, the backyard was more overgrown than the front. Leaves were matted down into the grass, clumped in the corners near the fence. The hedges along the back wall hadn't been trimmed in what looked like years. There was a small wooden bench near the far end of the yard, half covered in leaves, with faded blue cushions and a folded plaid blanket draped over one armrest. It looked like the kind of spot someone used to sit in all the time, but hadn't. For a while, as I worked, I kept glancing up toward the house. There were large windows on the back wall, but again the curtains remained closed. Still, I felt like I was being watched. Not in a creepy way, just a quiet awareness. Like when someone is silently standing in the same room as you, but doesn't say anything. It was odd, but not uncomfortable. The kind of thing that made you curious, rather than uneasy. Around midday, I finished clearing the leaves around the bench and started trimming the hedges, which had grown into thick, tangled shapes that looked like they had once been maintained with care. The clippers snapped through dry branches as I worked my way along the back fence. That's when I noticed a tan old ceramic planter knocked over behind the bushes. I reached in, set it upright, and found something unexpected, a small photo frame, half buried under the soil and leaves. The glass was cracked, but I could make out the image inside. It was Vanessa, younger by maybe 10 or 15 years, standing beside a tall man with graying hair. They were both smiling. The photo was taken in the same backyard, right near the bench. She looked different in the photo, not just younger, but lighter, like she hadn't yet learned to carry the weight I saw in her now. I brushed the dirt off and set it gently on the bench, unsure if she'd thrown it out or just lost it there. Part of me felt like I shouldn't have touched it at all. I returned to trimming the hedge, but the image stuck with me. It made me wonder who he was: husband, partner, maybe even someone she'd lost. The house didn't have the feeling of someone currently in love. Felt like a place recovering from something. As the afternoon sun started to dip lower in the sky, I heard the back door creak open. I turned and saw her standing there, arms crossed, cardigan wrapped tightly around her. She didn't step out right away, just stood there for a moment, watching the yard like she didn't quite recognize it anymore. Then her eyes landed on the bench and the photo frame I'd set there. She blinked, stepped forward slowly, and picked it up. She didn't look angry or sad, just tired. She held it in her hands for a while, as if deciding whether to say something, but ultimately just turned and walked back inside without a word. That night I kept thinking about how she'd looked at the photo like it had unlocked something she wasn't ready for, but it made me realize that whatever job I thought I was doing, it wasn't just about raking leaves anymore. Something else was unfolding here, and I was already too deep in it to back out. I came back again the next day, this time bringing my own lunch and a folding chair, figuring I'd take a longer break out back when the time came. The backyard looked cleaner already, the kind of clean that made you notice what was still left behind. The bench looked more like a memorial now. I didn't see her at first, but when I turned around after dropping my tools by the fence, I found her standing at the window, the curtain just slightly pulled back. Our eyes met for a second. She let go of the curtain and disappeared behind it. An hour later, she brought out a glass of lemonade without saying anything, just left it on the patio table and returned inside. It was strange, the stance we were. Doing no words, but each gesture held weight. Every movement, a kind of quiet conversation. And I found myself wanting to understand her more, not out of pity, but out of something deeper. Respect, maybe? Or recognition. Because while I didn't know what she'd been through, I'd seen enough people like her to know grief when I saw it. Not the loud kind that breaks you all at once, but the quiet kind that settles into your bones and makes a home there. I sat on the bench for a bit that afternoon, watching the sky shift from pale blue to smoky gray. The wind picked up again, scattering the leaves I'd raked into a neat pile. It felt like the yard was fighting me, like it didn't want to be clean just yet. But I kept at it, knowing that some things take more than a few days to fix. I packed up my tools that evening. I turned to glance at the house once more. And there she was, Vanessa standing in the doorway. This time she didn't just disappear. She gave a small nod, almost like a thank you, and then closed the door gently behind her. Something was shifting, not just in the yard. Not just in her, but in me too. The fourth day started colder than the rest. A layer of frost had crept over the edges of her lawn, and the air felt sharper on my face as I stepped out of my truck. I could see my breath, and the crunch of the grass beneath my boots made it clear that winter was ready to claim what fall hadn't finished. I tightened the collar of my jacket and began unloading my tools. The plan was simple: finish up the last of the trimming, bag the remaining leaves, and give the stone path in the back a good clearing. By most standards, this was my final day on the job. But something about it didn't feel like the end. Something lingered in the stillness that morning, like a pause between chapters rather than a closing line. The front yard was quiet, just, as always, no barking dogs, no passing cars. The neighbors were invisible, present in their silence, their shuttered windows, their drawn curtains. I was starting to understand what Vanessa meant when she talked about being watched. There was a kind of pressure in that quieted judgment that didn't speak, but still said enough. It wasn't paranoia, it was knowing. Knowing you were different in a place that didn't welcome change. I began raking slowly, trying to delay my move to the backyard. I wanted to give her space, unsure if yesterday's silent nod meant we were opening up or simply acknowledging coexistence. But curiosity got the better of me, and after finishing the front, I made my way through the side gate and back into the yard I was starting to know too well. The bench looked the same, but something had changed near it. The photo frame was gone. In its place was a folded newspaper, slightly damp on the edges. It wasn't a mistake. I could tell it had been placed there intentionally, maybe as a message, maybe as a bridge. I set my rake down, wiped off the top page, and saw the day tit was last week's local edition. The headline was small, tucked under the fold, but it caught my eye. Memorial for Jonathan Reed to be held this Sunday. I read the name again, slowly, letting it sink in. It sounded familiar, not because I knew the man, but because I had seen it before, in faded lettering on a mailbox near her address. During one of my first visits, I looked up at the house, then back down at the newspaper. Jonathan Reed. He must have been the man in the photo. Husband, brother, close friend. The notice said he was a retired high school music teacher and choir director, known for his dedication to students and his volunteer work in the community. It said he had died suddenly. No details, just the word suddenly, which always meant too soon. I folded the paper carefully and set it on the table near the back patio. I didn't feel right keeping it on the bench anymore. I kept working. After that, but my mind wasn't on the leaves. It was in that house, behind those curtains, wondering what kind of silence she was sitting in today. Not the comfortable kind I'd started to enjoy, but the aching, echoing kind that fills every room after someone's gone. I'd been around grief long enough to recognize it when it hovered near people. Some wore it like armor. Others folded it into their routines, pretending they were fine until it broke through in quiet ways. An old photo, an untouched chair, a newspaper headline. It was close to noon when the back door opened. Vanessa stepped outside slowly, her hands tucked into the sleeves of a knit sweater. Her eyes went straight to the bench, then to the table, and finally to me. I could feel the tension, not hostility, but the kind of discomfort that comes from being seen when you didn't plan to be. She walked to the table and picked up the paper. For a long time, she didn't say anything. Just stood there, holding it like it weighed more than it should. Then, softly, she said, "He hated raking leaves." Her voice was hoarse, not from crying, but from being unused. I didn't know if she meant to say it aloud, but it was out there now, floating between us. I paused in my work and nodded slowly, not sure what response would be the right one. Sometimes silence is the only kindness you can offer. She sat on the bench. The same bench where I'd first noticed the photo, stood still for a moment, unsure if I should go back to raking or give her privacy. But then she patted the spot beside her, just once. A small gesture, easy to miss. I took it for what it was and walked over, sitting beside her without a word. The sun had warmed the bench just enough to take the edge off the cold. We sat there, side by side, not looking at each other, but both staring out at the backyard. The silence this time felt different, not heavy or awkward, but shared, like we were both listening to something no one else could hear. After a few minutes, she spoke again, a little louder this time. "He used to sit out here and play music from his phone, classical mostly. Said it helped the plants grow better." She gave a faint smile, the first real one I'd seen. I told him they couldn't hear it, said they listened better than most people. I didn't interrupt. I just let her keep going, letting the rhythm of her memories fill the air between us. She talked about the way he burned toast every Saturday morning, how he whistled during movies, how he used to trim the hedges into strange shapes that looked like animals if you squinted just right. She didn't cry. Her voice stayed steady, but I could hear the layers beneath it. Grief, yes, but also affection. Love that hadn't gone away, even when the person had. After a while, she looked down at her hands, then over at me. "It's been 8 months," she said. "People think that's long enough to move on, but it's not a clock. It's not something you get over. It's just something you learn to live around." I nodded. "Some things stay with you, even when the people don't." Looked at me a moment longer, then stood and brushed off her sweater. "You've done a good job with the yard," she said. "It hasn't looked this clean since before he got sick." She turned to go back inside, but paused at the door. "I'll make lunch tomorrow, if you're coming back." I told her I would. She gave another small nod and disappeared behind the door. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I packed up slowly that day, not because I was tired, but because I didn't want to break the spell of that moment. The yard was almost done, the job nearly complete. But what I was beginning to understand was that this story, whatever it was becoming, had very little to do with leaves. The next day arrived with a wind that felt restless, tugging at my sleeves and scattering new leaves across the yard like the work I'd done hadn't mattered at all. But it did. It's not just in the physical sense, the trimmed hedges and cleared paths, but in the shift I felt every time I parked my truck outside Vanessa's house now. It was like I had stepped into a quiet ritual, and each visit had become part of something slower, more meaningful. I was no longer just a handyman on a 4-day job. I was a presence in her orbit, and in ways neither of us said out loud. I knew she was beginning to welcome that. When I walked around to the backyard, I noticed the bench had been cleaned, cushions fluffed, the blanket gone, and on the small patio table beside it, a single blue mug sat steaming in the cold. I hesitated for a moment, then set down my rake and approached. The mug was manure, rather, made for me. It had a cartoon rake painted on the side in crude strokes, the kind you'd see on cheap novelty gifts. Underneath it read, "Leaf it." To me, I smiled without meaning to. The gesture was small, almost silly, but it cracked something open in me. meant she was paying attention. It meant she'd thought about me after I'd left. She came out a few minutes later, holding her own cup, and didn't say anything as she sat on the bench. I joined her without asking, the same as the day before. This time the silence wasn't waiting for anything, it had become comfortable. Shared like an old blanket. We sat there, sipping quietly, while the wind rustled the last of the clinging leaves from the trees. After a few minutes, she reached into her coat pocket and handed me a photo. Wasn't the one I'd seen before. Was newer, taken maybe 2 or 3 years ago. She and Jonathan stood on that very patio, arms around each other, laughing. Not smiling, laughing. His head was thrown back, her eyes closed mid-laugh. It was candid and raw and beautiful. I looked at it longer than I meant to before handing it back. He was the first man I ever lived with who didn't try to fix me. She said softly. Didn't tell me I was too quiet, too cautious, too complicated. He just listened. Let that sit between us for a moment before responding. Sounds like he knew how to stay. She nodded. That's rare, you know? People can promise all sorts of things, but staying, that's the hard part. The way she said it made me wonder who else had left before Jonathan came along. What promises had been made and broken. What parts of herself she'd learned to hide just to keep someone a little longer. Now even Jonathan, who had stayed, who had listened, was gone. No wonder she moved like someone learning how to be seen again. We spent most of the morning together, though we barely spoke. Raked the last of the leaves along the side fence, while she sat on the porch reading a book. Occasionally I'd catch her watching me over the rim of her mug, and I'd pretend not to notice. But there was something warming in that gaze. Not romantic, not yet, but steady, curious. Like she was measuring who I really was beneath the job title, around noon. She stood and disappeared inside without a word. I figured that was my cue to wrap up, maybe even say goodbye for now, but a few minutes later, she returned holding 2 plates of grilled sandwiches and a bowl of steaming tomato soup. She nodded toward the patio table and set them down without meeting my eyes. I followed, sat, and we ate together in the brisk air without utensils or fanfare. It was the simplest lunch I'd had in months, and somehow the most comforting. She finally broke the silence as we finished eating. I used to be a school librarian, she said. Worked with kids for 20 years. They'd come in loud and leave quiet, and I always liked that knowing a story could do that to someone. I smiled. That's a rare kind of power. She looked up, her face thoughtful. Grief is a lot like a library after the lights are. Out, quiet, dusty, and filled with stories no one's checked out in years. That hit me harder than I expected, because I knew what it was like to carry stories you never told anyone. To live among your own pages without a reader. And here, we were 2 quiet lives that had somehow landed on the same chapter at the same time. That afternoon, I didn't rake much. Instead, I repaired a loose board on her fence. Tightened the hinges on her garden gate and trimmed a tree branch that threatened to scratch her window in the wind. It wasn't what I'd been hired for, but I did it because I wanted to. Her world was fraying at the edges, and I had hands that could steady it. Even for a while, when the day began to fade and the light turned golden, she stood at the back door again. Her arms were crossed, but her face was softer. She didn't speak this time. She just gave a little wave, like you do to someone who's been around long enough to not need instructions. As I packed my tools, I realized I didn't want this job. To end, not because of the work, but because of the silence we had built between us. It had grown into something sacred, something I didn't want to lose. The thought surprised me. I hadn't come here looking for connection, but maybe that's the only way it ever really finds you when your hands are busy. Your guard is down, and someone offers you lunch without asking why you're still here. I drove away that night slower than usual, my headlights sweeping across. Quiet homes and trimmed lawns, all hiding their own stories. And as I turned the corner at the end of her street, I caught a glimpse of one of her neighbors standing behind a curtain, watching me, watching her, watching the way something had changed in the stillness. They weren't wrong. Something was changing. It had been a week since I'd first stepped onto her property, rake in hand, thinking it was just another seasonal cleanup. Now I was making a second trip to the hardware store for things she hadn't asked for, but I'd quietly decided she needed new wood screws for the warped patio steps, a weatherproof cover for the bench, and replacement bulbs for the outdoor. String lights that hung limp and broken along the fence. On the way back to her house, I found myself driving slower again, watching how the late autumn sun dappled through the thinning trees along her street. There was something almost nostalgic about it all, like I was replaying a memory I hadn't lived yet, just felt in pieces. When I pulled up, she was already outside. Vanessa stood near the gate with a scarf wrapped loosely around her neck, holding 2 mugs. She gave a short wave, then walked back to the porch, leaving 1 mug on the table beside the bench. It was the same one as before. "Leave it to me." And somehow, the sight of it made me feel oddly steady, like I was expected now. Like she had made peace with the way I kept showing up. Tools in hand and no real reason to stay beyond the ones I couldn't name yet. I took my time walking to the bench, let the weight of the warm mug sit in my hands, and looked out across the yard that was beginning to look whole again. The leaves were mostly gone now. Only a few clung to the corners of the fence, or huddled. Under the shrubbery, like guests reluctant to leave after the party's over, she didn't sit beside me this time. Instead, she wandered across the grass, hands in her coat pockets, pausing every so often like she was inspecting the work I'd done, or maybe just remembering the last time this yard looked this way. Her hair was pulled back today, revealing more of her face than before, and it struck me how different she looked when she wasn't retreating into herself. There was a kind of quiet strength there, the kind that doesn't shout but simply endures. I waited until she made a full loop around the yard before I spoke. I noticed the lights along the fence, thought I'd fix those today. She turned, her gaze softening. "You don't have to. You've already done more than enough." "I know," I said, standing up slowly, stretching my back. "But I want to," she didn't argue. Just nodded once and said, "The ladder's in the shed." While I worked, she disappeared into the house. I heard the faint sound of music playing inside, just something low and smoky, and I found myself humming along without realizing it. The ladder creaked under my weight, and the breeze toyed with the frayed light strands as I threaded new bulbs into place. By the time I finished, the sun was starting to lower, casting a soft amber glow across the backyard. When I plugged in the extension cord and flipped the switch, the lights flickered to life, one by one, until the whole fence was bathed in a warm, golden hue. I stood there for a moment, not admiring my handiwork exactly, but letting the moment settle into place like a final puzzle piece. Vanessa stepped back outside, holding a plate with 2 slices of pie. "Apple," she said. "It's not homemade, just frozen from the store." But I thought, we should probably eat it before it gets freezer burn. I laughed. "Best reason I've ever heard for eating pie." We sat on the bench again, and this time she leaned back, visibly relaxed. The lights shimmered around us, and the air had just enough chill to justify how close we were sitting. It wasn't planned. We just drifted into it. "I keep waiting for someone to tell me I'm doing this wrong," she said after a while. "Doing what wrong?" "Living, grieving, talking to you." There was no accusation in her voice, just a kind of nervous honesty, like she needed to say it before it grew too heavy to carry. I glanced at her, then down at the ground where my boot traced a line through the frost-dusted grass. "I think the only way you get it wrong is by pretending it doesn't matter," I said. "Everything else is just figuring it out as you go." She didn't respond, but I could feel something settle in her. The tension that always hovered just beneath her words eased, and the silence that followed wasn't laced with doubt anymore. It was restful. Present, we sat like that for a long time. It's long enough for the sky to turn violet, and the lights to glow brighter by contrast. Long enough for our empty plates to cool, and the night noises to take over the yard. A few times we heard footsteps along the street behind her fence, neighbors walking their dogs, someone returning from work, and once, faintly, we heard a voice laugh too loud. Vanessa turned toward the sound briefly, then back to me. "That's why I said it that first day," she murmured, "about the neighbors." about coming inside before they saw us. I didn't press her. I just waited. They like their lines around here. Their categories, widow. Quiet, alone. They don't say it, but they expect it. Anything outside of that makes them uncomfortable. And me being here is outside of that. Gave a small shrug. You don't look like someone I'd be friends with. It's all it takes in this town. I thought about that for a while before responding. Well, I'm not trying to fit into their categories. I just like being here. That seemed to catch her off guard a little. She turned her head slowly, studying my face like she was trying to decide if she believed me. And why is that? She asked. I didn't have a clever answer, so I just told her the truth. 'Cause it feels like something real. I've had enough hollow things in my life. That night, I didn't drive home right away. I stayed until the lights dimmed with the motion timer, until the cold chased us both inside, and even then, I lingered at the door for a moment before saying goodbye. She didn't ask me to stay, but the way her eyes followed me said she didn't. Want me to go either? There was something brewing, something neither of us had put into words. It wasn't romance yet, it wasn't even comfort. But it was real, growing, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of it. As I walked back to my truck, I glanced one last time at the rows of houses beside hers. Most of them were dark now, but one directly across the street had. A living room light still on, silhouette stood behind the curtain. Watching, the next morning came with a steady drizzle tapping on my windshield as I parked in front of Vanessa's house. The street looked washed out in the gray light, the kind of morning where time seemed to move slower, like the weather itself was reluctant to start the day. The leaves I had cleared were gone now, and in their place, rain pooled gently on the stone path I had swept only days ago. Still, I stepped out with my jacket zipped and a thermos in hand, unsure if she'd expect me today, but hoping she might. I told myself I'd come to check on the gate one last time, make sure the wood hadn't warped from the shift in weather. But that was only half the truth. The real reason was simple. I missed the stillness of her backyard, the calm we'd somehow built in the spaces between everything unspoken. Vanessa opened the door before I had the chance to knock. She didn't look surprised to see me. In fact, she looked ready, like she'd been watching from the window and waiting for me to get out of the truck. She wore a thick cardigan buttoned all the way up, and her hair was tied in a loose bun. There was something gentler in her face today, less guarded. She motioned with a tilt of her head and stepped aside. And for the first time since I started this job, I followed her inside. The house was warm and quiet. A faint scent of cinnamon lingered in the air, and I could hear soft jazz playing from an old stereo near the kitchen. It wasn't what I expected. The space was filled with plants on windowsills, books stacked in uneven piles, framed photographs tucked between knickknacks on every surface. It felt lived in, deeply personal, like a life paused mid-sentence. She led me to a small sunroom, and the back walls of glass framed a view of the backyard, now slick with rain. A round table stood in the center, already set for two, with mismatched mugs and a small plate of croissants. She didn't say anything as she poured coffee into the mugs, only looked at me once with an unreadable expression, and then slid a cup toward me. We sat quietly listening to the rain. It drummed lightly against the windows and filled the silences. We didn't rush to break. I noticed a photo on the side table, Vanessa and Jonathan, standing in front of a theater marquee. Both were smiling, holding hands. The words behind them read, "Opening Night Fall Recital." I gestured toward it and asked, "Were you involved in music too?" She nodded, sipping her coffee. "I helped coordinate community performances back when he was teaching. School choirs, holiday concerts, things like that. I was never the performer. Jonathan had the stage presence. I just made sure the lights came on and the programs were folded right." I smiled. "Sounds like you made things work behind the scenes." "Still do," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the yard. "That's what most people don't realize about loss. It doesn't shout. It hums in the background, rearranging everything quietly." We stayed there for a while, the air between us filled with more than just words. Her vulnerability was no longer wrapped in silence. It had begun unfolding slowly, like a book she was allowing me to read a few pages at a time. Wasn't pushing. I was just there, the way someone stays when the party ends and the cleanup begins. Eventually, she leaned back and sighed. "You know, they still ask me if I'm moving. Some of the neighbors, they think this house is too big for me now. Do you want to move? I asked. She shook her head. No, but it's hard to explain that to people who've never built. A life in layers. Every wall in this place has held something. A fight. A laugh. A quiet Sunday morning. You don't just pack that into boxes. Her words settled into me like a stone in water, slow, heavy, and lasting. It reminded me of my mother after my father passed, how she refused to change a single piece of furniture for 2 years.
Ow.
Said it felt like moving him twice. And I realized then, as Vanessa sat across from me staring into the rain, that she wasn't clinging to the past. She was honoring it, holding it in place just long enough to learn how to carry it forward. After coffee, she showed me her small library, a converted bedroom with floor-to-ceiling shelves, a reading chair in the corner, and a lamp with a stained glass. Shade that cast amber patterns across the walls. The room smelled of old pages and something herbal, maybe eucalyptus. She trailed her fingers along the spines of the books as she walked. He loved biographies. I always preferred fiction. Said it was funny how I escaped into stories, but he chased after the truth. And did that ever bother you? I asked, watching as she smiled faintly. No, she said. It made us better, balanced. I think that's what most people misunderstand about love. It's not about agreeing on everything. It's about making space for each other's differences without needing to rewrite them. The rain eventually slowed, and I told her I should get going, that I'd come back to fix the seal on the side shed when things dried out. She didn't offer a date. She just said, I'll be here, and that was enough. As I walked back to my truck, the air smelled of wet earth and leaves. I glanced once more at the house before pulling away. Through the rain-streaked window, I saw her standing in the sunroom, holding her mug, watching me leave. There was no wave this time, just the simple act of watching like she wasn't ready to say goodbye, even for the day. On my way home, I thought about how little we'd actually said to each other and how much had been exchanged anyway. In a world addicted to noise, there was something sacred about being understood without speaking. And for the first time in years, I wasn't rushing to fill the silence. I was learning to sit in it. With her. With myself the next morning, before I had a chance to plan the day, she texted me. Just 4 words. You left your mug. I stared at the message for a long time, then replied, guess I'll have to come back. And somehow, that one simple exchange felt like a page turning. Not the end, not even the middle, just the beginning of a new chapter neither of us expected, but both of us were ready for. I returned that afternoon under clearer skies, the rain having finally pulled back, to reveal a cold, crisp calm. The clouds had begun to break apart, like drifting thoughts, and beams of late sun filtered through the tall sycamore trees lining Vanessa's yard, spotlighting patches of golden grass and clean stone walkways. The world outside felt freshly, rinsed, scrubbed raw by the storm, and I wondered whether something inside both of us had been quietly reset too. I carried nothing with me this time, no rake, no tools, no bag slung over my shoulder, just a paper bag with 2 muffins and that small, unspoken feeling of being welcome. She opened the door before I could knock. Again, it had become our rhythm. The quiet anticipation of presence, no schedule, no appointment, just an unvoiced agreement that I'd return when I needed to, and she would be there when I did. She didn't comment on the muffins, only gave a soft smirk as she took them from my hand and walked toward the kitchen. I followed her in, brushing past the threshold like I'd done it 100 times, though I still remembered the first time. I'd hesitated at this doorway, wondering if stepping in would unravel whatever fragile thread had begun tying us together. The house felt warmer this time, not just in temperature, but in spirit. Something had shifted. Maybe it was the scent of fresh coffee, or the soft hum of the dishwasher running in the background, or the way her cardigan sleeves were pushed up slightly like she'd been halfway through something before I arrived. Or maybe it was just that we were both finally beginning to exist here, not as strangers tentatively testing proximity, but as 2 people circling the edges of something meaningful. We sat at the little kitchen table this time. It had scratches along the top and a crackled veneer from years of use. Vanessa slid one of the muffins onto a plate for me and took the other for herself, tearing it in half with practiced fingers. She didn't fill the silence, and neither did I. It stretched gently between us like a thread pulled taut, but never tense. After a few bites, she glanced at me, then out the window, then back again. "You know," she said finally, "you're not what people expect." I swallowed, raising an eyebrow. "In what way?" "You don't look like someone who listens," she replied. "No offense. You've got that guarded working hands thing. Most people like that. They're all elbows and small talk. You don't fill space. You sort of fit into it." I wasn't sure how to take that, but I understood it. I'd been mistaken for blunt more times than I could count, been talked over, misread, ignored. Most people see hands that work and assume there's nothing else behind them. But Vanessa had seen more. Not quickly, not with assumptions, but through patient observation. And now, here she was, naming the very thing I'd spent years hiding. The tendency to listen more than speak, to retreat inward where it was quiet and still. Her words landed like a soft weight across my chest. Not heavy, but undeniable. She leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the old table. "You probably think I talk a lot." I gave a soft laugh. "Not really. I think you talk when it matters." That seemed to surprise her. For a moment, her posture shifted, almost shy. But then she nodded. "I guess I do." We finished our muffins in silence again, and after a little while, she stood and said she wanted to show me something. I followed her down a narrow hallway I hadn't been through before, past a closed door that I suspected was the bedroom, and into a small room filled with light. It was an art studio, or maybe just a space where she kept her attempts at being creative. There were easels stacked along the wall, unfinished paintings leaning against the far corner, a long table covered in brushes, water jars, and tubes of acrylics. She stepped into the room like someone slipping into a different version of herself. And I stood at the doorway, watching her return to that space. "I used to paint every week," she said, lifting a brush that was still crusted with dried blue. Paint stopped a year after he passed. It just felt hollow, like I was mimicking something without meaning. I walked in slowly, eyes drifting over the painting's landscapes, mostly with soft, dreamy color palettes. One showed a woman on a porch holding a mug, her hair blowing in the wind. Another was a forest scene, sunlight breaking through the trees in streaks of gold. They were good, really good. There was soul in them, not just technique. I turned to her. "Why'd you stop completely? Not even one since then?" She shrugged. I told myself I needed time, but after a while, you start confusing grief with identity. You wear it like a coat until it becomes the only thing that keeps you warm. Taking it off feels wrong. I wanted to tell her she didn't have to wear it all the time, that it was okay to hang it by the door sometimes and live in color again, but I didn't. She wasn't asking for advice. She was sharing a truth. And truth deserved to be heard, not fixed. She sat on the stool near the easel and looked up at me. "You think you'd ever pose for one?" I laughed at first, but when I saw her expression, I realized she was serious. "You mean like, is it here for you to paint?" She nodded. "I'm not promising it'll look like you. But maybe if I painted something that exists now, instead of something that I used to, I could remember how to begin again." And just like that, I understood what she needed. It's not a muse, but a moment. A reason to pick up the brush without apology. I stepped over to the chair across from her and sat down. "All right," I said, settling in. "Just don't make me look too serious. I'd hate to ruin your style." She smiled, and it was the first smile I'd seen from her that reached all the way to her eyes. Then she reached for a clean canvas and placed it on the easel. The room fell quiet again, save for the soft scratch of pencil as she outlined my face, my shoulders. The shape of someone who had unexpectedly become part of her unfinished world as she drew. I watched her, not just the way her hand moved, but the way her expression changed, focused, peaceful, present. She wasn't holding grief like a coat anymore. She was creating something from it, transforming silence into shape, pain into pigment. And in that quiet studio, surrounded by blank canvases and the echoes of things unsaid, something shifted in both of us. We weren't simply filling time anymore. We were building something delicate and real, one line at a time. The next few visits weren't about work anymore. Still pretended they were, bringing a wrench here, a box of nails there, checking on a leaky spout in the side yard, tightening a loose hinge on the gate, replacing a cracked tile on the porch. But those were just excuses, thin veils draped over something more personal, more deliberate. She didn't question it, and I didn't over-explain. We'd fallen into a rhythm that didn't demand clarity. I'd arrive just after 10, usually, with something small and hand a pastry, a bottle of mineral water. Once a faded paperback I'd found in a thrift store with her favorite author's name on the cover. She'd greet me like she always did, her voice soft, her smile just barely there but always real. And then we'd settle into whatever the day asked of us. It was a strange kind of comfort, the way we navigated each other. There was never pressure to entertain or impress. We spoke when it felt natural and lapsed into silence when it didn't. I'd rake leaves while she read on the porch. I'd fix something small while she painted. Sometimes we'd just sit in the backyard and watch the wind move through the trees, sipping tea while the shadows changed. The bond was forming like roots, slow, steady, unseen, but deep. One afternoon, I arrived to find her in the garage, sleeves rolled up, brushing off dust from old canvas tarps and boxes marked with fading Sharpie labels. She looked up and gave me a sheepish grin. Thought I'd tackle this today. Been meaning to clear it out since last spring. Offered to help, and she didn't resist. The garage was packed with decades of accumulation, tools, photo frames, holiday decorations, mismatched chairs, and a whole corner stacked with Jonathan's old musical gear. I could tell she hadn't opened that part of the space in a long while. She paused before we got there, her hand resting on a box labeled Recital 2014, her eyes lingering for a moment too long. "We can leave this part," I offered gently, not wanting to push her where she wasn't ready to go, but she shook her head slowly. "No, if I don't do it with someone here, I never will." We worked quietly, side by side, brushing off dust, sorting what could stay and what could go. She'd pause occasionally, holding a photo or a folded program, smiling faintly at the memory it sparked. At one point, she pulled out an old flannel. Shirt faded red and grayed, held it close to her face for a moment, her breath hitching just slightly. She didn't cry. She just nodded once, folded it gently, and placed it in a box marked Keep. Watching her navigate the ghosts of her past with such tenderness, I realized something. Vanessa wasn't trying to erase her history. She was simply making room for the present. Later, as we sat on the steps of the garage sipping lemonade, our hands dusty and our clothes flecked with cobwebs, she turned to me and said, "It's strange, you know. I thought if I started letting go of things, it'd feel like betrayal. But it doesn't. It feels like breathing." And that's when I knew she was healing, not by forgetting, but by acknowledging, by letting the past walk beside her instead. Ahead of her, that evening, as the light dipped into gold again, we sat in her sunroom with the French doors open, the breeze drifting in, and the smell of cut grass hanging in the air. She was painting again, this time not me, but something abstract, swirls of blue and gold and forest green bleeding into each other in soft waves. I didn't ask what it was. I just watched as her brush moved, steady and sure, like she was letting something inside her speak. After a while, she set the brush down and leaned back, stretching her arms behind her. "You know," she said, "there was a time I couldn't imagine letting anyone back into my life. Not here. Not like this." I nodded. "And now," she looked at me, her eyes softer than usual. "Now I wonder how I went so long without it." We didn't talk much after that. We didn't need to. I stayed until the painting was finished, watched her add the last brushstroke, and step back, arms crossed, head tilted. It wasn't a masterpiece. It wasn't meant to be. But it was alive, full of movement, full of her. She turned to me then. Standing a little closer than usual, her hands stained with color, her hair pulled loose from the bun. "I think I'm going to be okay," she said, almost as if the words surprised her. "I know you are," I said, and for the first time, she didn't look away. We stood there, the fading light wrapping around us, something electric pulsing in the silence. Not urgency, not need, just presence. Two people standing in the middle of a life neither had planned, finally realizing it was okay to let it change shape. When I left that night, I didn't feel the usual ache of partying. Instead, I felt something settle in me like a seed had been planted, and I didn't need to rush it. It would grow in its own time, quietly, steadily. The next morning, there was no text from her. "No, you forgot this." Or "Are you coming today?" And that was okay too. Some days don't need contact. They just need memory. I spent the morning walking around my own small apartment, noticing the silence in a new way. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with echoes of something soft and real. Her voice, her laugh, the way she looked when she spoke about Jonathan. The way her eyes lingered on the light between leaves. I realized I was beginning to carry her with me, not in the way a man claims something, but in the way a man finally starts to make room. And for once I didn't rush to fill the day with tasks. I didn't check the sink or tighten any bolts. I let myself sit with it. With her absence, with her presence. That afternoon, just as I poured a second cup of coffee, a photo appeared on my phone. No message, just an image. It was the painting she'd finished the night before, now hung on the wall of her sunroom, sunlight streaming across it. Below it, in the corner of the frame, was that same mug I'd left behind on the first visit. I stared at it for a long time, then typed 2 words and hit send. "Looks perfect." Seconds later, her reply blinked in. "So do you." The next time I returned to Vanessa's house, there was no project waiting for me. No pretense, no task, no leaf pile demanding my attention. I showed up carrying nothing but a book under my arm, and a vague sense that maybe we had turned some invisible corner way. From fixing and toward simply being, the gate was already open when I arrived, as if she'd anticipated my quiet entrance. Her house no longer felt like a client's home or a stranger's sanctuary. It felt like the place where time paused, where everything artificial fell away, and the conversations we didn't have still somehow filled the space between us. She met me on the back porch this time, wrapped in a faded quilt and holding a second cup of coffee like she'd poured it just moments before hearing my truck roll up. She didn't ask why I came. She didn't need to. That had become our way. No reasons, no expectations, just this growing understanding, wordless but unmistakable. I sat beside her, accepted the cup with a nod, and we stared out at the backyard, where the last of the autumn leaves clung to the trees like memories reluctant to fall. We sat like that for a long while, sipping slowly, watching the wind toy with the edges of the season. There was a peace to it's I hadn't felt with anyone in a long time. Vanessa shifted beside me, pulling the quilt tighter, and murmured something I almost missed. "I used to hate this silence after Jonathan passed. It was too loud." I glanced at her, and now she let out a soft breath. "Now it's different. It's shared." Her words hit something in me. I'd grown used to silence myself, learned to wear it like armor in a world that often shouted more than it listened. But she was right. Shared silence was different. It asked nothing. It only offered space. The sun climbed a little higher, and she eventually stood, stretching with a quiet groan before heading inside. I followed her in, familiar now with the soft creak of her wooden floors, the way the morning light curved through her kitchen windows, touching everything with gold. She pulled out a frying pan and started cracking eggs into a bowl, glancing at me with a smirk. "You want to make yourself useful today?" she asked. I grinned. Thought I already was. She laughed. Genuine one this time, not the cautious kind I'd grown used to hearing. "You're right. You've become very good at moral support." So I grabbed a spatula and joined her at the stove, and together we cooked like 2 people who'd done it for years. There were no awkward steps, no clashing elbows or clumsy messes. Just rhythm, the easy kind, born not from familiarity but from respect. She didn't need help. She accepted it anyway, and that felt important. After breakfast, we cleaned up in comfortable silence. I washed, she dried. Occasionally our hands would brush, and neither of us would pull away too quickly. When we were done, she reached into a drawer and pulled out a small envelope. Holding it out to me, "I found this the other night," she said. "I meant to show you." Inside was a photograph. Showed her and Jonathan much younger, sitting on what looked like a blanket in the very backyard we'd just been staring at. He had his arm around her, and she was laughing as closed, head tilted back, mouth open. She looked free in a way that felt almost sacred. On the back of the photo, scribbled in blue ink, was a date, October 1999. I barely remember this day, she whispered. But seeing it again, it's like I'm standing inside that moment. Do you think it's strange, holding on to these pieces? I looked at the picture again, then at her. I think it's human. We're all just piecing things together, aren't we? A little past, a little present, and a whole lot of hoping we're doing it right. She didn't respond immediately, just nodded slowly, then set the photo down and took a deep breath. You know, you've never really told me about yourself. Not really, I chuckled. That's true. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed. So tell me something. Anything. Who were you before you were the quiet guy raking leaves for lonely widows? The question wasn't mocking. It was curious, open. So I gave her something true. I used to be married, I said, briefly. It didn't end badly. It just faded. We wanted different things. She needed a man with ambition. I just wanted a quiet life. So we let each other go. Vanessa tilted her head. Do you regret it? I thought about that for a moment. Sometimes, but mostly I regret who I was during it. I was trying to be something I'm not. And I think she loved the idea of me more than the actual me. She absorbed that in silence, then said, I think a lot of us do that. Love the idea, not the person. Maybe because the idea doesn't disappoint. We stood there, both of us leaning against the edges of the kitchen island. The air between us thick with history, not shared, but suddenly intertwined. Then, after a pause, she smiled. Well, she said, for what it's worth, I like the actual you. It was such a simple thing to say, and yet it cracked something open inside me. I wasn't used to kindness that didn't come with strings or sarcasm. Vanessa had always been sharp, honest, and private. For her to say that meant something. It meant I wasn't just someone passing through that afternoon. We went for a walk through the neighborhood, something we'd never done before. It was chilly, but the sun helped. Leaves crunched beneath our feet, and she pointed out houses. She'd always admired small details like a carved porch post, a rose trellis, a painted mailbox. She saw beauty in the ordinary. It was one of the first things I noticed about her. And now I saw it not just in the world around her, but in her too. When we returned, she paused just outside her front door, eyes scanning the street, you know? She said, her voice lower. The neighbors are probably watching us right now. I looked around and saw an older man, across the street pulling weeds and sneaking glances in our direction. She leaned closer and whispered, Come in before the neighbors see us. The way she said I tit wasn't flirty or coy. It was intimate, protective, like we were sharing something worth shielding. I followed her inside, and for the first time I understood what it meant. This wasn't about hiding. It was about preserving. Some things didn't need an audience. Some things were sacred in their slowness. Inside, the light from the windows caught her face just right, and she looked at me with something unspoken in her eyes. Not urgency, not desire, just quiet permission to be there, to stay a little longer, and I did. It was easy to forget how new all of this was, how recent the first day had been. The rake, the leaves, the hesitant offer to step inside before the neighbors saw. It had only been a matter of weeks, but the rhythm between us felt as if it had always existed, like it had been waiting quietly under the surface of both our lives, needing only the right season to emerge. There was no label, no definition, placed on what we were doing, but there was a comfort, a certainty in the way we moved around each other. It was like slipping into warm clothes you hadn't worn in years, finding they still fit better than expected. I found myself staying longer each time I visited, what used to be an hour of work stretched into afternoons of shared silence, late, lunches, and wandering conversations. I'd bring over things without thinking, an extra pair of gloves when the wind picked up. A loaf of bread I'd picked up from the market, a tiny jar of honey she once mentioned liking. Vanessa began doing the same. She'd leave folded towels for me near the kitchen door when it rained, tea in my favorite mug without asking. and once even baked a pie, just because she had a feeling I'd be by. One day she brought out an old board game and placed it on the living room table, dusting it off like it was an artifact from another life. It was a 2-player strategy game, something she said she used to play with Jonathan during winter evenings. We were both terrible at it, she said, sitting cross-legged on the floor across from me, but it always made us laugh. I haven't touched it since he passed. There was a flicker of vulnerability in her voice, but also a kind of steady resolve. She was allowing herself to make space, not to replace what had been lost, but to reshape the silence it left behind. We played for hours, both as bad as she promised we'd be, but neither of us cared. Every silly move, every groan of defeat, every shared laugh felt like another brick placed between us, building something solid from moments that asked nothing. More than presence, as evening crept in and the house settled into its quiet, I noticed her eyes beginning to linger longer, her glances carrying something unspoken. I felt it, too, that soft current that hums beneath the surface when you know something is changing, deepening, preparing to become more than it was. But neither of us rushed it. We stayed where we were on the floor, surrounded by game pieces and empty tea mugs, letting the moment stretch until it folded gently into stillness. Over the following days, I started noticing little things about her I hadn't before. The way she hummed quietly when she stirred soup, always slightly off-key. How she rearranged the books on her shelves every few days as if seeking new energy in the room. How she stared out the window in the morning, eyes distant but not sad, as if remembering something worth smiling about. It wasn't just affection I felt, it was admiration, the slow-burning kind that creeps up through observation and settles in your chest, like a truth you didn't realize you needed. And I could tell she noticed things about me, too. She began asking questions that went beyond polite curiosity. She wanted to know how I spent my time when I wasn't here, what I read before bed, if I believed in soulmates. They were small, intimate queries that told me she was letting me in one breath at a time, gauging whether I would hold her truths with care. I answered honestly, not always eloquently, but with a steadiness I hoped she could feel. One morning, I arrived earlier than usual, just after sunrise. The grass was still damp with dew, and the air had a bite to it. I knocked, expecting to wait, but the door swung open almost immediately. She stood there in a thick sweater, hair unbrushed, barefoot, looking surprised and not at all displeased. "Didn't expect you this early," she said. I held up a thermos of coffee. "Thought you might like a warm start to the day." Sighed and let me in, taking the thermos with a grateful smile. The kitchen was still dim, only light coming from the stove's overhead bulb and the faint blue hue of morning creeping in through the windows. She poured us both a cup and leaned against the counter. We didn't talk much that morning. Didn't need to. The silence was gentle, familiar. It wrapped around us like a shared coat. We stood there, sipping coffee, watching the slow reveal of daylight through fogged glass. Eventually, she turned to me, eyes softer than I'd ever seen them. "Have you ever thought," she began slowly, "that maybe the people who are meant to stay don't arrive when we want them to, but when we're finally ready?" I didn't answer right away. I looked at her, at the line of worry that still lingered near her brow, at the way her hand curled around her mug like she was anchoring herself to the warmth. I thought about the timing of it all, how my truck just happened to pull onto her street one morning with no expectations, how she had let a stranger in not just to rake her leaves, but to sit with her grief, to witness her rebuilding. "I think you're right," I said. "But I also think we don't always recognize them." At first, she gave a small laugh. "Maybe not. Maybe we just feel something shift." Quietly. And there it was again, that quiet. Not absence, not void, it's just space. And in that space, the pieces were beginning to settle. Not perfectly, not neatly, but naturally. We spent the rest of that morning in the backyard, pruning back the bushes that had grown wild during the last stretch of summer. She handed me clippers without speaking, and I worked alongside her as she snipped carefully at overgrowth, occasionally pausing to examine a bloom or check for new shoots. There was something almost meditative in the work. Simple, satisfying, alive. Afterward, we sat on the steps again, hands dirty, sleeves rolled up. the scent of crushed leaves still clinging to the air. "I used to think love had to be dramatic," she said out of nowhere. "All fireworks and declarations and grand gestures. But now, I think it might be this." I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't need to. Because I felt it too. The changes between us weren't marked by anything obvious. There wasn't a confession under moonlight or a kiss that rewrote everything in an instant. Instead, it was in the accumulation of small, consistent moments unremarkable on their own, but when strung together, they formed something unshakable. The way she began to wait for me with the porch light on, even before dusk settled. When I started calling her before I left the house, not to announce my arrival, but just to hear her voice. It felt like we had carved out a parallel life right inside the boundaries of our separate ones, and neither of us seemed ready to label it, as if naming it would break whatever quiet magic had built between us. One particular afternoon, the kind where the clouds hung low and the air smelled like rain but none had fallen yet, I found her in the side garden, kneeling among the rose bushes. She was humming again, the same out-of-tune melody she always fell back on. Something I couldn't place, but had grown oddly fond of. She looked up as I walked over, her hands covered in soil, cheeks flushed, and smiled like she had been expecting me, not because I said I was coming, but because by now, she always just knew. "I'm losing the battle with these thorns," she said, holding up a gloved hand with a few visible pricks on the fabric. But I refused to let them win. I knelt beside her, pulled on the spare pair of gloves she kept near the steps just for me, and joined in. We didn't talk much. The earth between our fingers was enough. There was something ancient about the way two people could share labor, not for a goal, but for the companionship it quietly bred. As we worked, a wind stirred, and a light drizzle began falling. She made no move to get up, and neither did I. The rain was soft, more mist than storm, and we let it bead on our skin, drip from our brows, gather on the petals of the roses we hadn't yet trimmed. It was as if the day itself had decided to be gentle. When the rain passed, we sat on the stone bench beneath the archway, both of us soaked and muddy, and she turned to me with a tired smile. "You're not very good at knowing when to go home," I smirked. "And you're not very good at asking me to." That earned a laugh. It was still rare, still precious. And I stored it away like I did every other piece of her she offered. Eventually she stood, brushed herself off, and without saying anything, reached for my hand. She pulled me to my feet and led me inside through the back door, our boots leaving streaks of dirt across the tile floor that neither of us bothered to clean right away. She disappeared into the hall and came back with 2 towels, tossing one to me. "You're going to catch a cold." I dried my hair, watching her out of the corner of my eye. She moved through her space with ease now, not in performance, but in comfort. When she sat down on the couch, wrapping the towel around her shoulders like a shawl, she patted the spot beside her. I joined her without hesitation. There was a movie playing quietly on the television, something neither of us had been following. And the room had that post-rain hush to it, the kind of silence that made everything feel suspended. She turned toward me after a while, one knee tucked beneath her, eyes thoughtful. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded. "Anything. If you weren't here, who would you be with right now?" It wasn't a question, loaded with jealousy or implication. It was curiosity, plain and vulnerable. I thought about it for a long moment before answering. Probably be alone. Maybe working, maybe at some hardware store, wandering the aisles just to pass the time. But I wouldn't be talking to anyone. Not really. She seemed to absorb that slowly, nodding once. "And do you miss it?" The solitude. I glanced around her home, at the quiet corners now so familiar, the way the shadows moved across the walls as the sun began to return outside. I looked back at her. I think I needed it once. But now, I think I was waiting for something that didn't have a name. She exhaled, her shoulders relaxing. I think I was too. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. And when she reached for my hand again, lacing her fingers through mine, I didn't question it. I didn't need to. It wasn't romantic in the way movies taught us to expect. It was deeper than that. It was the simple act of 2 people choosing, Not to be alone when they didn't have to be. Later, as the sky turned a deep amber and the breeze picked up again, she walked me to the door like she always did. But this time, just before I stepped onto the porch, she said, "Stay a while longer." There was no hesitation in my response. I turned back inside, closed the door gently behind me, and followed her back into the house where the kettle was starting to whistle. That evening unfolded in quiet layers. We drank tea at her kitchen table, shared stories from our 20s we hadn't told yet, played another round of the board game we were both still bad at, and watched the stars blink alive through her skylight. At some point, she stood and wandered over to the piano in the corner of the living room, one I'd noticed countless times but never heard her touch. She sat, lifted the cover, and ran her fingers lightly over the keys. "I'm out of practice," she warned. "I won't judge." She played a soft, uncertain melody, stopping occasionally to correct herself, laughing under her breath when the wrong notes rang out. But it was beautiful anyway, not because it was perfect, but because it was hers. When she finished, she looked at me across the room, her eyes catching the faint reflection of the moonlight on the window pane. "I never thought I'd let someone back in like this." "You didn't," I said. "You let me in slowly. That's different." She smiled. Not big, not dramatic, but enough. And in that moment, I knew we weren't just circling something unnamed anymore. We were stepping into it. Not all at once, not with declarations or urgency, but with trust, with time, with the kind of care that builds a home without hammer or nail. Outside, the wind picked up again, leaves dancing along the sidewalk. The season was shifting, and so were we. The days grew colder, but her home never felt warmer. Outside, the branches emptied themselves of the last leaves, their silhouettes more skeletal with each passing week. New signs of life: 2 mugs, always drying by the sink, a pair of my work boots sitting beside hers at the entryway, a stack of books I had begun leaving on the end table. Vanessa never commented on these changes aloud, but she didn't remove them either. That quiet acceptance was louder than any words could have been. We had slipped into something that resembled routine, yet didn't carry the weight or pressure of obligation. It was a rhythm shaped by presence, by mutual choosing. One particularly crisp morning, I arrived with a bag of groceries slung over my shoulder. She had mentioned offhandedly the day before that she missed her mother's vegetable stew, the kind that simmered for hours and tasted better the next day. I hadn't made it before, but I figured it was as good a day as any to learn. She greeted me at the door with sleepy eyes and a knit cardigan wrapped tightly around her shoulders, and without saying a word, stepped aside to let me in. That was one of the things I'd come to love about Vanessa. Her silences never felt cold. They were invitations in disguise. We spent the next hour peeling, chopping, stirring. The kitchen smelled of garlic and thyme, of something hearty and safe. Occasionally, she'd pass behind me to grab a spoon or a bowl and let her hand brush against my back, casual, but charged with an awareness we both felt. And though the air was scented with food, it was thick with the unspoken. We hadn't named what we were, hadn't dared call it a relationship or romance or anything that might impose structure onto something that felt so organically its own. But the moment spoke for us. When the stew was finally done, we filled our bowls and carried them to the couch, sitting close but not quite touching, as the steam curled upward in lazy spirals. We ate slowly, letting the warmth fill more than our stomachs. Then, after a while, she turned to me with a strange expression, something between curiosity and caution. "I had a dream last night," she said. "You were in it." I set my bowl down. "Good dream or bad?" She tilted her head. "It was different. You were here in this house, but it wasn't now. It was years from now. I had white hair. You had more lines on your face. But we were sitting here just like this. Number. Words, just ... together." I didn't know what to say at first. There was a depth to her voice that carried more weight than the words alone. She wasn't just sharing a dream. She was testing the water for something bigger, something that scared her. It's just enough to approach in the safety of fiction. "What did it feel like?" I asked. She looked down at her hands, peaceful, like everything that needed to happen had happened. For a long moment, we sat with that, It wasn't a declaration, wasn't even a question, but it was enough to shift the current under our feet. She had imagined a future with me in it, not as a guest, but as part of the architecture of her life. And somehow it didn't scare me either. It felt natural, inevitable, like arriving at a destination you didn't even realize you'd been. Walking toward. That evening, we took a walk through the neighborhood just before dusk. The air was cold enough to nip at our fingers, and she wore a knit hat that made her look younger somehow, more playful. We passed familiar houses, each now etched into my memory with stories she had told me. When we reached the end of the block, she paused and pointed toward an old oak tree near the corner. "Jonathan carved our initials into that tree," she said quietly. "It's faded now, but I still know where it is." She walked up to the bark, traced a finger along a barely visible J+V. Her breath caught slightly, and I stayed back, letting her have that moment. It wasn't about me. It was about memory, about honoring a part of her that would always live alongside whatever we were becoming. When she turned back, there were no tears, just a softness in her eyes I hadn't seen before. "I used to think that loving someone again meant betraying him," she whispered. "But now, ... now I think it means I've survived." I stepped closer, not to offer words, but to be present, to hold the weight of that revelation with her, and she reached for my hand. We stood like that beneath the tree as the last light of day disappeared behind the roofs. There was something sacred in that quiet farewell and a welcome all at once. That night, back at her house, I started to notice how her home had changed. Not in big ways, but in subtle ones. A second toothbrush had appeared in the bathroom. My flannel jacket hung on the same hook as her scarf. A small photo frame sat on the mantel, one we had taken together on her back porch when the sun had hit us just right, and she had laughed with her whole face. These weren't signs of assumption. They were signs of permission. As I got up to leave, she stopped me at the door. "Stay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just for tonight." There was no hesitation in me. I nodded, stepped back inside, and closed the door gently behind me. We didn't rush into each other's arms. We didn't tumble into anything cinematic. Instead, we ended up back on the couch, her head resting against my shoulder, a blanket pulled over our legs. Outside, the wind picked up, and the trees swayed in time. Inside, her breathing slowed, syncing with mine, and there, in the gentle hum of her living room, I realized that this slow unfolding, this earned trust, this quiet companionship, was a kind of love I'd never known I could have. It's not loud, not all-consuming, but steady, certain, whole. Morning arrived slowly, slipping into the house like a polite guest. I woke to the soft creak of old wood and the golden spill of sunlight across the living room floor. Vanessa was still beside me, curled slightly inward, one hand resting near mine under the shared blanket. For a moment, I didn't move. I just listened to the sound of her breath, steady, slow, full of the kind of peace you can't force. The house, too, was still. No distant humming from the fridge, no clattering dishes or footsteps overhead. It was the kind of silence you rarely find. I stayed in it for as long as I could before my body stirred without permission. When I shifted, Vanessa stirred too, blinking herself into wakefulness. She smiled when our eyes met, not the wide kind that people give when they're trying to say something unspoken, but a soft, half-sleepy curl of the lips that spoke more of comfort than anything else. I greeted her quietly, and she stretched like a cat, sitting up and rubbing her neck as if she'd forgotten we hadn't gone to bed in the usual way. Neither of us said anything about the night before. We didn't need to. The warmth of her hand briefly brushing mine as she stood up was enough. She made coffee while I folded the blanket. There was a rhythm to mornings like this now, unspoken roles we'd grown into like a well-worn coat. She brewed. I tidied. She hummed under her breath. I pretended not to notice the off-key notes that had somehow become one of my favorite sounds. The scent of fresh grounds and toasted bread eventually filled the space. I found myself wondering, not for the first time, how something so ordinary could feel so sacred. We ate in the breakfast nook, watching birds flutter around the frost-covered lawn. The trees were nearly bare now, their last stubborn leaves clinging with stubborn grace. Vanessa was reading the paper, one of her rituals, while I absently scrolled through my phone. It hit me then, a quiet truth sliding into my mind like a pebble dropped in a pond. I hadn't thought about leaving, not just in the moment, but in a larger sense. I hadn't thought about what came next because in my bones, I didn't want anything to come next if it wasn't here. With her, she must have noticed the shift in my posture because she folded the paper and set it aside. "What's on your mind?" she asked, voice low. I hesitated, not out of fear, but because I wanted to get it right. I was just thinking, I've never stayed anywhere this long without packing up at least once, without planning my next move. She tilted her head, considering, and now I don't want to move. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Just like that, 1,000 unsaid things settled into place. It was the closest either of us had come to calling this what it was. Not yet. The day unfolded with its usual ease. We did chores side by side, laundry, folding her, sorting through a box of old photos while I swept the back porch. Occasionally she'd call me over to show me a picture, her voice dipping into stories from years past. Told me about her sister who lived in Montana, about her college days when she'd wanted to be a photographer, about her brief obsession with horseback riding that ended in a sprained ankle and a newfound respect for stubborn animals. These weren't things you shared with someone you expected to leave. These were roots being offered slowly and deliberately. Later, that afternoon, I caught her staring out the kitchen window, her expression distant. I walked up behind her, my presence soft, careful not to startle her. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded, but it wasn't convincing. "Just thinking," she said. "About what?" She hesitated, then turned to face me. "About how quickly things change. A few weeks ago, you were just the guy raking leaves outside, and now you're in my kitchen, making coffee, knowing where I keep the tea towels." I chuckled lightly, then let the quiet return between us. But she wasn't finished. "It's not bad," she added quickly. "It's just new, and sometimes I think about how fragile new things can be." I understood what she meant. We weren't young. This wasn't the kind of whirlwind love story you'd see in movies, where passion burst through the seams and logic was left behind. This was slower, steadier, built brick by brick, and that made it even more terrifying in some ways, because the deeper the foundation, the more it hurt if it cracked. "I don't want to rush this," I said carefully. "I'm here, not going anywhere, but we don't have to define it all right now." She looked up at me, relief flickering behind her eyes. "Thank you," she said, "for understanding." That evening, we took a drive into the hills. She said she needed air, and I offered to take the wheel. We didn't have a destination in mind. We passed rustling fields, empty roadside diners, and stretches of golden horizon that reminded me of childhood summers I hadn't thought of in years. Eventually, we pulled over at a scenic overlook. The sky was painted in every hue of orange and lavender. It's a kind of view that made the silence between us feel vast and profound. She leaned against the hood of the car, arms crossed, staring out into the expanse. "Do you think it's possible to fall in love again?" she asked suddenly. "Not just with a person, but with life." I joined her, standing close but not touching. "I think that's the only kind of love that matters," I said. "Kind that sneaks in when you think you've already used it all up." She looked at me then, not with fear or uncertainty, but with something else, something deeper. "I want to believe that." "Then start with me," I said. "You don't have to call it anything, just ... be in it." She didn't reply. Reached out instead, took my hand, and held it as the last of the sun disappeared behind the hills. And in that moment, I knew we were no longer two people passing time. We were building something, slow, quiet, unnamed but real. The drive back home was quiet but not empty. It was the kind of silence that holds meaning, shared awareness that something had shifted in the way two people carry each other. Vanessa stared out the window most of the way, her hand resting lightly on my knee, her fingers making slow, absent-minded circles that sent little currents through me. The night had grown colder, and the heater inside the truck hummed with a low persistence, blending with the static of a radio station too far away to come through clearly. By the time we reached her driveway, the sky had turned a deeper shade of blue, and the house stood quiet and waiting. Lights glowing warmly behind the windows like an invitation to step back into the moment we were still living. We didn't talk. Much as we walked through the door, didn't need to. She hung her coat by the door, and I followed suit, towing off my boots in the hallway without a word. She padded into the kitchen to make tea, and I drifted into the living room, sinking into the couch that had somehow become mine, or maybe ours. Everything about the house felt different now, because anything had physically changed. But because the distance between us had softened, it was no longer that slight hesitation, that question hovering in the air of what we were doing. We still didn't have a name for it, but we were both fully in it now. Like stepping into a tide you no longer tried to fight. She brought the tea in, handing me a mug that was warm enough to chase away the chill still clinging to my fingers. She sat beside me, tucked her legs underneath her, and leaned into the crook of my arm like it was the most natural thing in the world. For a while we just sat there sipping quietly. The steam rose between us in thin wisps, catching the lamplight. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, sending another flurry of dry leaves skittering across the porch. We could hear them tapping against the front door like they were asking to be let in. Inside, though, we were still wrapped in a kind of peace neither of us had expected when we first met, over a pile of leaves and an offhand comment about nosy neighbors. Eventually, she broke the silence. She told me about a recurring dream she used to have when she first became a widow. How it always started the same way, her walking through an empty house, opening doors and finding nothing behind them, just blank walls or endless corridors. The dream would always end with her standing on her back porch, staring out at a garden that no longer grew. She said it stopped showing up in her sleep after the third or fourth time I came by. She didn't know why. I didn't need to ask. Some things don't need explanations. Some things are just healed by presence alone. We talked late into the night. Not just about dreams or the past, but about ordinary things to what she used to do before the bookstore closed. How I had once almost moved to Oregon on a whim, how neither of us really liked the taste of sweet potatoes, but kept pretending. 2. At family dinners, because it was expected. The laughter between us came easier now, more freely. And even the pauses in conversation felt like parts of a song we were both learning to play by ear. I remember thinking, not for the first time, that this unfolding was the kind of love no one ever warns you about. The slow-burning kind. The one that sneaks in through the small gestures until you wake up one day and realize it's been there the whole time. It's just waiting to be noticed. The next morning, I woke before her and stepped outside to the front yard. The leaves had returned, scattered all over the lawn like nature had pressed rewind overnight. I picked up the rake without thinking, started gathering them into piles again. There was something satisfying about the motion, the way each stroke drew order out of chaos. As I worked, I glanced up at the porch where I had first met her, remembered how different everything had felt then, how guarded she had been, how quietly curious. And now, even the porch felt like part of the story. Like an opening line, we'd finally learned how to continue, about halfway through. I heard the front door creak open and felt her eyes on me. She was standing there in her robe, a mug in her hand, that familiar sleepy look in her eyes that somehow made my chest tighten every time. She didn't call out, just watched me for a while, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Then she stepped outside and walked down the porch steps barefoot, crunching softly through the leaves until she stood beside me. "You're doing it again," she said quietly, and I turned to see that she was holding out my flannel jacket, the one I had left on the coat hook. Took it, slipping it on, her hands brushing mine briefly in the process. "Old habits," I said. "You know me, always tidying up someone else's yard." She laughed softly, then bent down to gather some leaves herself. Before long, we were both at it, working side by side again, just as we had when all this started. But now, the silence between us wasn't new or unsure. It was lived in, comfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes after the storm, not before it. Later, when the sun was higher and our piles of leaves had become small mountains around the yard, we sat on the porch steps and watched them swirl. Occasionally with the breeze, I leaned back on my elbows, and she rested her head on my shoulder and for a long time, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The leaves, the sun, the shared effort, all of it said what we couldn't quite name. And in that moment, surrounded by the same yard that once felt like just another job, I realized it had become something else entirely. A marker. A witness. The place where a life quietly changed direction. Where two people, both carrying more past than they knew what to do with, found something unexpected in the most ordinary corner of the world. Not fire, not thunder, not fate, just warmth. Just choice. The days that followed felt suspended in amber. Slow and golden, as if time itself had chosen to move more gently around us. Each morning I returned to Vanessa's place, sometimes with pastries from the bakery down the road, sometimes with nothing more than the promise of my company. She always opened the door with that same amused expression, like she was still surprised to see me there, even though by now we both knew I wasn't going anywhere. I began to help her with things that had nothing to do with leaves or fences replacing. A squeaky cabinet hinge, fixing a broken dresser drawer, unclogging the bathroom sink. They were small tasks, the kind of work that didn't require much thought, but I came to look forward to them because they gave me reason to linger in her. Space to see the way she moved through her home. To exist quietly in the background of her days. There was something healing in the simplicity of it all. We didn't talk much about the future, and when we did, it was only in the vaguest of terms. Maybe a weekend trip here, maybe a new paint job for the bedroom in the spring. But we were planning, even if we didn't say it out loud. We were weaving each other into our days, stitching small threads of shared intention into the fabric of our routines. And for someone like me, who had lived so long on the periphery of permanence, that alone felt monumental. One afternoon, while she was sorting through an old trunk of winter clothes in the attic, I found a worn notebook tucked behind a stack of records. It wasn't hidden, exactly, but it didn't seem like something she intended for company to find. I debated for a moment, then opened it carefully, flipping through the pages. Inside were entries written in her handwriting, short reflections. Sketches of thoughts, fragments of poems. Some were dated from years ago, back when she was still married. Others were more recent, less structured, more raw. One entry caught my eye. It read, "I wonder if it's possible to fall in love with someone's quiet. Not their words, not their promises. Just the way they occupy space when they think no one's watching." I closed the notebook gently, my heart thudding, and slid it back where I found it. I didn't need to ask if it was about me. I didn't need to tell her I'd read it. Some truths are better held in silence. That evening, as the wind picked up and the windows began to rattle slightly in their frames, we lit candles around the living room and listened to a record she had pulled from the trunk. The crackle of the vinyl filled the space between us as we sat on the floor, a half-finished puzzle spread out in front of us. She leaned over the edge of the coffee table, squinting at a piece, and I watched the flicker of candlelight dance across her face. It struck me then, more than it ever had before, how much of her I had come to memorize the way she held her tea with both hands when she was thinking. The little furrow that formed between her brows when she was concentrating, the way her laugh always started low in her throat before spilling out freely, and in memorizing her, I had begun to find pieces of myself again. Not the version I had been pretending to be all these years, the drifting, disconnected man who showed up just to finish a job, but the one I'd buried beneath all that solitude. The one who still believed in showing up and staying and being. Chosen, we finished the puzzle sometime past midnight, both of us blinking sleep from our eyes as we placed the final piece. It was a picture of an old countryside cottage surrounded by wildflowers. The kind of place you'd imagine belonged to people who grew old together in peace. Vanessa stared at it for a long moment, then turned to me and said, "Do you think people like us ever really get that kind of ending?" Her voice wasn't sad, exactly, but there was a weariness in it, a history. I didn't answer right away. I reached for her hand instead, laced my fingers through hers, and gave them a gentle squeeze. "I think the ending depends on what kind of story you're willing to tell," I said. "And I'd rather keep telling this one with you, even if it takes 1,000 chapters." That night, we shared a bed knot in the rushed, burning way of new lovers, but with a tenderness that felt almost sacred. Her head rested against my chest, and I traced circles on her shoulder as the wind howled outside. It was the first time I had ever felt truly at home in someone else's bed. And not just because of the warmth, or the softness, or the way her body curled instinctively toward mine. It was because I had earned this closeness, day by day, with patience and care, and in turn, she had chosen to let me stay. The next morning, I awoke to find her already downstairs, humming softly as she stirred something on the stove. I followed. The sound, still half asleep, and found her in the kitchen bathed in golden light, wearing one of my old t-shirts that hung too long on her frame. She smiled when she saw me, that same sleepy smile that never failed to undo me, and motioned for me to sit. "Thought I'd surprise you with breakfast," she said, though full disclosure, I may have burned the first batch of pancakes. I laughed and sat down, watching her move around the kitchen like she had done it 100 times before, and maybe she had. But today it felt different. Today it felt like the beginning of something more solid. As we ate, she told me about a letter she had found from her husband, one he had written years ago and never given her, tucked into a box of keepsakes. It was about love, she said. About how he hoped I'd find it again, even after him. He said he didn't want me to spend the rest of my life mourning what we lost. He wanted me to find someone who would see me, not just as a widow, but as a whole person. Her voice faltered slightly, but she didn't look away. I think I'm starting to believe him. I reached across the table and took her hand, not to comfort, but to acknowledge. To say yes, without needing to say it. We were still finding our footing, but the ground beneath us had started to hold. We had come a long way from rakes and leaves and cautious glances. We were writing something else now, quietly, steadily. Together, the first real snow arrived 2 days later. I was outside when the flakes started falling, small and hesitant at first, like the sky was unsure if it wanted to commit. Vanessa stood by the window with a mug in her hands, watching as I pulled the last of the rakes and garden tools into the shed. I hadn't said it out loud yet, but I knew the season was changing for more than just the trees. The yard work was done, the leaves were gone, and in their place, something else was settling, quieter, deeper, and far more permanent. God, feel it in the way her porch light stayed on for me now. It's not just because I was working late, but because I belonged here. When I stepped inside and stomped the snow from my boots, she greeted me not with words, but with a towel and a kiss to my cheek. It wasn't grand or theatrical, but it held more weight than most declarations ever could. We had stopped tiptoeing around what this was. Somewhere between morning coffees and half-finished puzzles, we had leaned fully into it. It didn't need to be defined to be real. It just was. And now, with the first snow falling and the air turning sharp with cold, we were beginning to understand what it meant to weather life together, not just in metaphor, but in the small, daily things that built a world between two people. That evening, as the snow thickened, we settled into the living room with blankets and a fire crackling in the hearth. Vanessa had pulled out an old album of Christmas records and let them play softly in the background. The lights were dim. The wind whispered against the windows like a secret. Sat side by side on the couch, not touching at first, just sharing space. But after a while, she leaned her head against my shoulder and let out a long, slow breath. "You ever think about how life turns out nothing like you planned?" she asked after a few minutes. "All the time," I said. "But lately, I'm starting to think that's a good thing." She nodded, and we both went quiet again. The song changed. A familiar tune about snow and sleigh bells, warm fires, and longings that stretched across years. I could feel her heart beating faintly where our arms touched. And in that moment, I realized that this small corner of the world we'd carved out for ourselves was enough. More than enough. It wasn't flashy or extraordinary, but it was ours. It was steady. The snow continued through the night. By morning, the yard had transformed into a soft white blanket, the fences and trees dressed in powdery stillness. I stood on the porch with a cup of coffee in hand, watching the world turn quiet. Vanessa came up behind me, wrapping her arms around my waist, resting her chin between my shoulder blades. "You've made this place warmer," she murmured, and I felt the truth of it settle into my chest. Later that day, we decided to take A walk down to the lake. It was frozen at the edges, the surface reflecting the overcast sky like a giant sheet of glass. She wore a thick scarf wrapped around her neck twice, and I pulled my beanie lower over my ears as we made our way through the snow-covered path. We didn't talk much on the way. The silence wasn't heavy. It was companionable. Two people breathing in the same winter air, their footsteps in sync. When we reached the lake, she took off her gloves and reached for my hand. It was cold, but she didn't flinch. She just held it tight, like she'd been doing it forever. "You." "No," she said, eyes on the frozen water. "When I first met you. I thought you'd be gone the moment the last leaf was raked." "I thought so too," I admitted. "But you stayed." "Yeah," I said. "I stayed." She smiled, and it was one of those smiles that stayed with you long after the moment passed. That evening, we cooked dinner together. She let me chop vegetables, while she stirred a pot of something that smelled like rosemary and home. I talked about nothing in particular. An old neighbor who used to shovel snow in shorts. The way the grocery store played the same holiday music on repeat. A memory she had from childhood about baking cookies with her mother. The conversation moved easily, unhurried, and light. And somewhere between stirring and seasoning, she looked at me and said, "This feels like the beginning of something." "It is," I replied without thinking. We didn't need to clarify what we meant. We both knew. After dinner, we lit candles and watched the snow fall from the warmth of the living room. I read aloud from one of the novels she kept stacked by the couch, and she listened with her legs draped over mine, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns on my arm. The pages blurred after a while, my voice growing softer. Eventually, we just sat in the hush of the room, letting the moment carry us. That night, she asked if I would stay again. I didn't hesitate. She made up the bed, and we slipped under the covers like we had done it 100 times. And maybe we had not in practice then in the spaces we'd shared over the past few weeks. Spaces that had grown fuller and fuller until it was impossible to imagine them without the other person in them. As she lay beside me, eyes fluttering shut, I realized I wasn't just in her home now, I was in her life. Her rhythms had become my own. Her mornings, her stories, her quiet thoughts that spilled out just before sleep. They were all pieces of something we were building. Something real and good. Before I drifted off, I whispered almost without meaning to, "I'm not going anywhere." She didn't respond with words. She just reached for my hand under the blanket and held it tight. The snow didn't stop for 3 more days. It blanketed the town in stillness, muting every street and tree, pressing pause on the usual rhythm of things. Most people grumbled about the inconvenience, but to me, it felt like permission. Permission to slow down, to burrow in deeper, to spend my mornings wrapped in Vanessa's world, with no pressure to leave. Her home had become our sanctuary one. We rarely stepped out of that week except to grab firewood or to shovel a path. On the porch, but even those small tasks felt less like chores and more like rituals, things done together in quiet harmony. The kind of acts you don't think twice about when you're no longer alone. We filled the hours with shared habits. I learned she liked reading the obituaries in the paper, not out of morbidity. She said, but because she liked hearing how people were remembered. I told her about my strange ability to remember useless trivia from documentaries I watched years ago. She'd test me with random questions just to see if I could still recall how jellyfish reproduce or what year some ancient tree was carbon. Dated, we played board games, we made soup, watched the same movie 3 nights in a row because neither of us wanted to admit how comforting it had become to fall asleep to its soundtrack. And through all of it, there was this steady pulse, this quiet, unspoken certainty that whatever we were building wasn't temporary. One morning, just as the sky began to blush with dawn, I woke up to find her already awake beside me, her face turned toward the window. Her expression was soft, thoughtful, the kind of gaze that stretches past the glass and into something deeper. "What are you thinking about?" I murmured, my voice hoarse with sleep. She didn't answer right away. When she did, it was with that quiet certainty I was beginning to recognize as hers. "I'm thinking about how it's been years since I let someone see me this clearly," she said, "and how easy you've made it feel." I didn't know how to respond at first. The words mattered too much to offer back something hollow or overly sweet. So instead, I reached for her hand and held it against my chest, letting her feel the steady rhythm beneath my ribs. That day, we spent the morning reorganizing the attic. It wasn't planned. She had just mentioned offhand that she'd always meant to tackle it. And before we knew it, we were climbing the creaky ladder with mugs of coffee and flashlights. The attic was a museum of her life boxers of old clothes, faded Christmas decorations, a trunk filled with her late husband's things. She let me open it with her, though I could tell she hadn't touched it in years. Inside were photos, ticket stubs, love letters, and a worn navy sweater that still smelled faintly of cologne. She held it for a long moment before folding it back into the trunk and gently closing the lid. "I'll always love him," she said softly, not looking at me. "But I'm ready to make space for someone else now." That moment didn't ask for more. It didn't need resolution. It just needed to be honored. So I stood there with her in the dust and silence and simply nodded, letting the weight of her truth settle between us. Later, after the attic had been cleared and the last box sealed, we sat on the porch with thick blankets wrapped around us and mugs of something hot in our hands. The snow had started again, soft and slow, like a memory repeating itself. She looked at me then with an expression I hadn't seen before, something deeper than affection, something like relief. "You know what scares me the most?" she asked. I shook my head, that this could all disappear. I might wake up one morning and it'll have been some beautiful mistake. That you'll get tired of this town, of this house, of me. I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted her to hear every word when I did. "I used to think I was only built for passing through," I said. "That I wasn't made for staying or for being chosen. But then I met you. And now, the idea of leaving, of not waking up to you each day, doesn't feel like freedom anymore. It feels like losing something I didn't even know I needed until it was mine." She didn't cry. She just leaned in and rested her head against mine, and we sat like that until the snow covered the steps again that night. We baked cookies just for the scent, laughed when they came out burnt, and ended up eating toast with jam instead. It wasn't about perfection. Nothing between us was. It was about presence, about knowing that someone would still laugh with you when the recipe failed or when the power flickered for a few seconds and left the house in momentary darkness. We were learning how to live with each other's flaws, each other's ghosts. And in that learning, we found a kind of peace that neither of us had expected. Before bed, she handed me an envelope. Inside was a photo of her younger self standing beside a garden that didn't exist anymore, her arms around her husband, both of them laughing. On the back, she had written one sentence: "There's room on the other side of grief." I didn't ask what she meant. I just held the photo like something sacred, then placed it back in the envelope and set it gently on the nightstand. That evening, as we curled beneath the same blanket and the wind brushed snow against the windows, once more, I felt her reach for my hand again. And I understood that we were no longer building toward something. We were in it. We had arrived. By the end of the week, the snowplows had finally cleared the main roads and life in the town began to stretch itself back into motion. People returned to their errands. The distant hum of traffic resumed, and the outside world slowly reclaimed its rhythm. But inside Vanessa's home, time still moved at the unhurried pace we had come to cherish. Our days had grown into rituals. A shared presents coffee brewed before sunrise, crossword puzzle left half-finished at the kitchen table, hands brushing as we passed each other in the hallway. It was not a fairy tale, not the kind of love story that demanded grand gestures or sweeping declarations, but it was real, tangible, quietly transformative. And for me, it was everything. That Sunday morning, she surprised me with a visit to the town's winter market. We bundled ourselves in coats and scarves and walked down together, hands clasped inside thick gloves. The streets were lined with stalls, offering hot cider, cinnamon sticks, handmade ornaments, and knitwear in every color. There was laughter in the air, and a brass band played old holiday tunes near the community gazebo. She waved to old friends and neighbors, some of whom gave us curious, lingering looks. We had kept things low, no announcement, no official labels, but in a town as small as this, news didn't need to travel far. The fact that we arrived together, walked in sync, and moved as a single rhythm was enough for people to start putting pieces together, and frankly, we let them. At one point, we stopped by a stall selling wood-carved name signs, and I noticed she ran her fingers across a piece that read "Welcome Home." She didn't say anything, but I saw the way. Her hand lingered and the soft smile that tugged at her mouth. I bought it when she wasn't looking and tucked it into my jacket. Later, I planned to mount it just outside her front door. Our front door. It felt like the right kind of quiet symbol for what had shifted between us. No fireworks, no spotlight. Just the knowledge that something sacred had taken root and would not be shaken easily. After the market, we visited the local diner, the kind with squeaky booths and coffee that somehow always tasted the same. She used to go there with her husband, she told me, though not often. He wasn't much for small-town chatter, she said, stirring her cream into the coffee. You, though, you belong in this kind of place. You listen, you notice things. I shrugged, but the compliment stayed with me, being seen that clearly it wasn't something I was used to. And yet she did it so easily, so often, that I had stopped flinching from it. I had started slowly to believe her. Back at home, we unpacked our finds and prepared for another quiet evening. But something about the day, maybe it was the way the town had looked at us, or the ache that came with being out in the cold, had stirred something inside both of us. There was a depth to the way she kissed me that night, a lingering need. In the way her hands held my face. We didn't speak much as we undressed beneath the soft glow of the bedroom lamp. Didn't explain or overthink the sudden urgency. We just let ourselves fall into each other, not recklessly, but with a kind of trust that can only be born out of steady showing up. Afterward, as we lay tangled beneath the covers, her breathing still slow and shallow beside me, I realized wasn't afraid. Not of this closeness. Not of tomorrow. Not even of the idea that we might someday lose what we had. Because for the first time in my life, I had built something worth grieving if it ever ended. And that was its own kind of blessing. Next morning, I found her in the kitchen with her glasses on, flipping through a recipe book. She had circled a page with sticky notes and drawn a little smiley face beside it. Thinking of hosting a dinner, she said almost casually. Nothing big. Just a few people. Maybe us together. I raised an eyebrow and stepped closer. You mean telling people? She nodded. I do. And then she added with a grin. Unless you'd rather keep being my mysterious handyman who rakes leaves and steals hearts in secret. I laughed and wrapped my arms around her waist. I think the neighbors already know, I whispered. And she let out a warm chuckle that filled the room like sunlight. We spent the afternoon preparing dusting off her dining room, pulling out the good plates, lighting candles that had long been stored away in drawers. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about making space, literally and figuratively. About saying without apology that this was something real, something worth gathering around. That night, as the first guests arrived, her friend Cynthia from the library, an older couple from church, the mailman who always delivered packages with a smile, there was a hum of joy that buzzed beneath every hello and handshake. People noticed the way I stayed close to her side. They noticed the easy laughter, the shared glances, the way our elbows touched when we passed dishes. And no one asked questions. They didn't need to. Toward the end of the evening, as the conversation turned to snow predictions and travel plans, someone asked how we'd met. Vanessa glanced at me with a look that was both teasing and tender, then said he was raking my leaves when I first invited him in. The room laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was perfect. I felt something shift in the air, not just approval, but blessing. That unspoken thing communities do when they silently root for something that feels good and right. When the guests had gone and the candles had burned low, I stood on the porch with her, staring out at the snow-covered yard where it had all begun. She slipped her arm through mine and leaned against me. You stayed, she said, not as a question, but as a simple truth. I did, I replied. She was quiet for a long moment, then turned to me. "And if I asked you now, to stay for good, not just the season, not just until the snow melts," I didn't hesitate. "Then I'd hang my coat in the closet and call this place mine too." She nodded, then smiled. "Good. 'Cause I think I'm done watching people leave." The days that followed had a softness to them, like everything we did was cushioned by a deeper kind of peace. The winter sun rose later, lingered lower, and bathed her home in a mellow amber glow that stretched through the curtains and warmed the floors. I found myself moving through the house as if it were my own, out of assumption, but because it had welcomed me, absorbed me, and made room without resistance. I repaired the squeaky cupboard door in the kitchen, cleaned out the chimney. When the fire began to flicker unevenly and replaced the loose porch step she'd been meaning to fix for years, she'd watch me sometimes from the doorway, arms crossed loosely over her chest, smiling that quiet smile that said more than words ever could. There was something sacred in the ordinary now. The way she'd hand me my mug before I asked for it, the way I always knew which drawer she kept her spare socks in when her feet got cold. We didn't need ceremony. Every touch, every glance, every passing of a dish or brush of fingertips as we moved through the house felt like a vow, a quiet promise that we were here and we weren't going anywhere. One morning, while shoveling the driveway after another night of snow, I saw her through the frosted window, dancing in the kitchen to a song only she could hear, her sleeves rolled up and her hair tied back loosely. I paused with the shovel, midair, and just watched, something in my chest tightening not from doubt or fear, but from the realization that I had somehow stepped into the middle of a life I hadn't known I needed until it embraced me. That afternoon, we went through the box of holiday decorations stored in her basement. Most of them were dated, a little dusty, relics of a time before the house had grown so still. There were ornaments painted by children's hands, old photographs folded into snow globes, and a hand-knitted stocking with her name stitched in red. As we unraveled the tangled lights and sorted through the tangled garlands, she hesitated on a small ceramic angel. It had a chipped wing and a faded ribbon, but she cradled it like it held every memory she hadn't spoken aloud. "I haven't put this up since he passed," she whispered, not looking at me. It felt wrong, like I was trying to pretend he was still here. I didn't rush her. I didn't say anything about moving on or letting go. Instead, I waited. And after a long moment, she placed the angel gently on the mantel, next to the candles we always lit in the evening. Her hands lingered on it for a second longer, then dropped to her sides as she exhaled. "There," she said quietly, "belongs here." That night we decorated the tree together. It wasn't perfect. The lights were uneven, and the top star leaned a little to the left, but it was beautiful in the way that only real, lived-in moments are. We listened to old jazz records while I lifted her so she could hang the last ornament near the top. When she stepped down, our faces were close, not to kiss, not to smile against each other's skin. And so we did. Slowly, deliberately, like we were sealing something that had already been decided weeks ago. We sat by the fire afterward, her head on my shoulder, my hand resting on her knee. The house felt alive, full of memory and hope, old grief and new beginnings, all stitched together by the laughter that echoed off the walls, the shadows that danced with the flickering flames. She looked at me then, not with a question, but with understanding. Like she saw the whole road behind me, the tiredness I had carried, the loneliness that had lingered longer than I'd let on. And in her eyes, I saw my own reflection, not as I had been, but as I had become someone who had found a reason to stop wandering the next morning. I started bringing in my things, not with fanfare, not all at once. Just a few shirts, a book or two, a jacket hung beside hers. She noticed, of course, but she didn't comment. Instead, she cleared out a drawer for me in her dresser, then later a space in the bathroom cabinet. One by one, my belongings became part of her home's quiet order, and neither of us treated it like a milestone. It was simply the next right thing, the natural progression of something we had both decided without needing to say it. On one of the colder nights that week, the power flickered out just after dusk. We were in the middle of cooking, the oven humming, the lights warm above us, when suddenly the whole house dropped into silence. She reached for my hand instinctively, and we stood in the kitchen for a moment, letting our eyes adjust. I grabbed the emergency lantern from the hallway. She lit 3 candles, placing them on the windowsills like little beacons. Dinner became a simpler affair: soup, reheated over a gas flame, bread toasted with a lighter and a wire rack butt. It was one of the best meals we'd shared. Something about the flickering light and the closeness of the dark outside made every word we exchanged feel like a secret. Afterward, curled up on the couch under one thick blanket and listened to the wind against the windows. She told me stories from her 20s, about the time she got lost in Paris on her own and had to mime her way through 3 conversations just to find her hotel. I told her about the one job I walked away from midday because the homeowner screamed at me over a scratch I didn't make. We laughed until our stomachs hurt. When the lights came back on hours later, we didn't even notice. The world had already narrowed to just the 2 of us. The warmth between our bodies and the hum of something deep and quiet taking root. Later that week, I found a small envelope tucked between the pages of one of her books. It wasn't addressed, but inside was a short note written in her handwriting. It said, "I didn't expect you. I didn't plan for this, but somehow you fit, like you've always been meant to be here." I never told her I found it. I didn't need to. I just kissed her forehead that night before bed a little more slowly, pulled the covers over her with a little more care, and let her drift to sleep knowing she was safe. That we both were. The holiday came and went in a blur of soft snow, warm bread, and quiet evenings wrapped in each other's presence. The town seemed to slow with us, as if the universe itself had taken a deep breath and settled into winter's lull. Days bled gently into one another. Coffee at dawn, short walks. In the snow, shared glances that no longer needed explanation. Vanessa and I had stopped keeping count of how long I'd been there. Time was no longer measured in weeks or days, but in the way the house began to carry both our scents. How the closets whispered of his and hers without needing labels. How the mail on the table sometimes had both our names on it, even if it wasn't official yet. We had grown into each other the way ivy takes to brick, slowly, steadily, completely. One morning I stepped outside to fetch the newspaper and found a note taped to her door. It was handwritten in careful cursive, folded twice, and signed Mrs. Callahan, the same woman who used to watch me rake Vanessa's yard with suspicious eyes. The note read, "I used to worry she'd never open her heart again. Glad you proved me wrong." I stood there on the porch, the note trembling lightly in the wind, and I felt something in my chest unclench. This town, these people, they weren't just tolerating me. They were rooting for us. And that felt like the final permission I hadn't realized I needed. That evening, I told Vanessa about the note, expecting a smirk or a witty comment, but she just nodded. Then, after a moment, she said, "That means a lot. You don't know how many years I spent dodging sympathy and side eyes. It's nice to be seen as whole again, not just as someone who lost something." I took her hand then, and we stood in the kitchen in silence, listening to the stew bubbling on the stove. The snow tapping lightly against the windows, the clock ticking like a heartbeat. These sounds had become the music of our life. Winter eventually loosened its grip, and the snow began to retreat in wet patches across the lawn. The trees budded shyly, as if unsure whether it was safe to bloom yet. But even before the full flush of spring, we decided to redo the garden. It started with clearing out old beds, pulling weeds, and turning the soil. She had gardening gloves from years ago, and I bought new tools meant to stay. We knelt in the dirt together, our hands muddy, sleeves rolled, hair tousled by wind and sun. She told me the names of every flower she once grew, pointed out where the roses used to bloom, and I listened as if every petal she described still lived somewhere beneath the surface, waiting to return. One day, while placing new bulbs in the earth, I looked up at her and said, "This house has seen a lot, hasn't it?" She nodded slowly, brushing her hair from her face with the back of her wrist. "Yes, but it's never felt like this before, not since I first bought it. It feels like a beginning again." I didn't respond with words. I leaned in, pressed my forehead against hers, And in the warmth of that moment, I understood something unspoken between us. We were planting more than flowers. We were planting permanence. Later that week, I took a trip back to my old apartment. I hadn't been there in months, not since I'd brought that first duffel bag to Vanessa's house. The space felt hollow, as if I'd already vacated it in spirit long ago. I packed up the rest of my things, my books, my photos, my favorite mug, and left the key on the counter. There was no sadness in the goodbye, just the recognition that I had outgrown what that place once meant to me. But I didn't tell Vanessa. I wanted to surprise her. And when I returned, everything I owned was in the back of my truck. She stepped outside, blinking against the sun, and I held up the last box. "Guess I'll need another drawer," I said. She didn't laugh. She just reached for my hand, pulled me close, and whispered, "Welcome home." As spring unfurled itself across the town, we hosted another dinner, this time with fresh tulips in a vase by the window. The scent of lemon bars cooling on the counter, and the front door left open to let in the breeze. The neighbors came, this time bringing dishes of their own, and one by one, they dropped the pretense of politeness and simply celebrated with us. Someone brought out an old guitar. Someone else offered to teach Vanessa how to waltz again. We weren't just that couple anymore. We were part of the fabric now. That night, after the guests left and we climbed into bed, Vanessa turned to me and said, "You know, that first day I almost didn't say it." I blinked at her in the soft lamplight. "Didn't say what?" She smiled, a little shy now, as if remembering something she hadn't told me before. "When I told you to come in before the neighbors saw us, it wasn't just a joke. It was me daring myself to let you pass the front door, not just into the house, into everything." I kissed her then, not with passion, but with the reverence you give someone who cracked something open inside you. "I'm glad you did," I whispered now. When I look out the window and see the garden blooming againtulips, daisies, and even those stubborn roses that finally came back, I don't just see a yard. I see a story that began with a rake, a quiet woman, and a small moment of trust. I see a life rebuilt from brokenness, not to erase the past, but to grow something beside it, something new, something ours. And every time I pass through that doorway, remember what she said? Come in before the neighbors see us, as if loving someone like this had to be hidden. But now there's nothing secret about us. We are loud in the quietest ways, bright in the softest moments, and deeply, deeply known. And every morning I wake up next to her. I know I've found the only place I've ever wanted to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.